I fear I am beyond your comprehension, but you, Saruman, I understand now too well. I keep a clearer memory of your arguments and deeds than you suppose. When last I visited you, you were the jailer of Mordor, and there I was to be sent. Nay, the guest who has escaped from the roof will think twice before he comes back in by the door. Nay, I do not think I will come up. But listen, Saruman, for the last time. Will you not come down? Isengard has proved less strong than your hope and fancy made it. So may other things in which you still have trust. Hey everyone, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we are going to start looking at the differences between the Return of the King movie and book, with the movie being Peter Jackson's extended edition. However, before we really get in too far into the video, the first difference we have is that, while most of this video will be looking at the beginning of the Return of the King movie, most of the source material is actually from the end of the Two Towers book. This is when the timelines of both the movie and the book, as well as the timelines between the Frodo story and Gandalf, Theoden, and Aragorn stories, are actually quite confusing. I'll link some related articles and videos that helped this video happen in the description below, as well as some articles with timelines in them to place when exactly these events between the movie and the book happen. Also, I'll put a link to the rest of this series in the description and cards as well. And since much of the Two Towers book inspires many scenes in the Return of the King movie, and since the movie missed many scenes from the Return of the King book, this movie and book of the What's Different series will have more episodes than the others to tell about everything. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me. Let's begin our tale. We will begin with the movie version of Frodo, Sam, and Gollum's journey towards the Morgul Vale. At the beginning of the Return of the King film, we have a scene with Smeagol and Deagol in the Vales of Anduin, when Deagol found the ring in the river, where it was lost by Isildur ere his death, and Smeagol, who was celebrating his birthday, was quickly overcome by his lust for the ring. Soon this led to conflict and the death of Deagol. Smeagol was cast out of his home and came to be Gollum. Then the scene came back to the present, where Frodo, Sam, and Gollum were camping on the outskirts of Mordor and the Ethel Duath. We also get a scene where Smeagol and Gollum are talking about taking the ring, and Sam overhears, leading to more conflict between Gollum and Sam. Frodo comes in and breaks up the fight, depicting more of this movie-only Frodo and Sam issue, as they are divided over Gollum. They continued on to the crossroads in Ithilien, where they found the headless statue of the King of Gondor. The light shines on the nearby head that was removed from the statue, where flowers bloom as a crown, and Sam points it out to Frodo, before darkness covers it. The hobbits and Gollum pressed on. In the book, there are actually quite a few differences here concerning the continuity of everything. The scene concerning Smeagol and Deagol is expressed in Gandalf's conversation to Frodo in Bag End, in the Fellowship of the Ring book, in the chapter The Shadow of the Past. The happenings of that event are relatively similar in both the book and the movie, as described by Gandalf. But in the Journey to the Crossroads chapter, as it is with many of the book's tellings of the story, it is filled with more detail and dialogue between characters than in the telling of the movie. Sam dreamt of Bag End, only to wake and realize where he was, and that it was getting darker, but it was still midday, according to Frodo. Throughout this chapter, Sam and Frodo have conversations similar to those they had had in past chapters, about Sam's distrust of Gollum, their need for the creature, the nature of their journey, and if there would be a return journey. Tolkien described how the landscape changed, coming from Ithilien closer to the Morgul Vale, just as we see visually in the movie, with more brambles and thorny bushes. But Gollum's anxiety grew quite apparent on this journey, and the hobbits were forced to travel by night and hide and sleep by day. The darkness of Mordor quickly approached, as the dawnless day was soon to begin, and Pippin and Gandalf far away had reached Minas Tirith earlier that day, and Aragorn was traveling from Erech to Calimbel, for it was March 9th, going into March 10th of 3019. At twilight they reached the crossroads, and though they knew not who the king that statue represented was, and though the head was also removed, it gave Frodo hope when he saw it, wreathed in flowers and the light of twilight, and Frodo pointed it out to Sam, opposite to how it was in the movie, for the last bit of light of that day fell on the king, and Frodo knew Sauron could not conquer forever. Then the sun fell, and it would be the last time Frodo saw sunlight unabated by the darkness of Mordor, until after the destruction of the ring. They moved on into the Morgul Vale, for Gollum knew they needed haste. Since the other part of the story in the movie version spent more time in Rohan and needed more time to catch up to Frodo in the chronological order of the canon in its book counterpart, that is where we will end Frodo, Sam, and Gollum's part of the story for this video. We come back to the other heroes on their way to Isengard after the Battle of Helm's Deep in the movie. The victors from Helm's Deep made their way through the forest to the Ring of Isengard, finding Merry and Pippin enjoying some well-earned comforts. They reunite and make their way to Orthanc, where they talk to Treebeard, and then Saruman confronts the men of Rohan and their friends. Saruman sees Gandalf's power as the new White Wizard absorbs a fireball, which is only a movie thing, and then Gandalf breaks Saruman's staff, and we see a bit of the power of Saruman's voice, and a conflict between he and Grima Wormtongue that eventually leads to Saruman and Grima's deaths at Orthanc. Pippin picks up the Palantir dropped by Saruman and Gandalf takes it quickly. Soon the company makes for Edoras again, where they take celebrations for their victories and remember the fallen. In the movie, we also get a scene between Aragorn and Gandalf talking about if they think Frodo is still alive and what Gandalf's heart tells him. It's quite a sweet movie-only scene. Éowyn speaks of her dream of a great wave climbing over the hills and a great cataclysm. These moments in Edoras are only in the book, but Éowyn's dream references a dream Faramir had in the books of the destruction of Númenor, being similar to a dream Tolkien himself often had. Later, Pippin looks in the Palantir and is saved by Gandalf. They know then Gondor is next under threat, and after telling Aragorn and Theoden to be ready for Gondor's call, Gandalf and Pippin made for Minas Tirith upon Shadowfax, while Merry and Aragorn looked on. Theoden also ponders whether Rohan should go to Gondor's aid, for Gondor did not come to their aid in their time of need. In the book, Theoden remembered more of the honor of his ancestors and of Eorl's tradition to help Gondor when Gondor needed it, so this was not in question. Also, before we switch to the differences in the book, Arwen has some scenes where on her way to the Grey Havens, she has a vision of Aragorn and her son-to-be, Eldarion. This convinces her not to forsake Aragorn and Middle-earth, and to convince her father Elrond to reforge Narsil into Andúril. We also have scenes where Arwen is weakening as she gave up the grace of the Eldar, and in the books we don't really have such scenes as it happens more covertly. This is only really a movie aspect, and it gives the character of Arwen more to do. For in the books, Arwen had long before decided to marry Aragorn, when eventually he fulfills Elrond's doom that the elf had laid upon him, and Andúril had been reforged back in the Fellowship of the Ring, and had been given to Aragorn before the Fellowship departed. Alright, so now we come to the book's version of these events, where there's a lot to unpack. First, the characters acted more hasty in the books, for they had less time to spend in Rohan than they did in the movies. And this is many days before Frodo even approached the crossroads, being March 4th of 3019. So nearly immediately after the Battle of Helm's Deep, Gandalf made ready to lead any others who would join him to Isengard, for he wanted to speak to Saruman, and, as he does in the movie, provide mercy in exchange for information. Again, we got far more character interactions in the book, and the chapters take their time to describe the coming of Gandalf and the others to Isengard. Gimli and Legolas promised to visit the Glittering Caves in Fangorn after the war together, and the group remarked at seeing Ents, and they come up to the river Isen, where they spent the night. There, the company was made aware of a great shadow passing them, for the Horns had made a great mound of the fallen orcs near Helm's Deep, and came back up north towards Fangorn in the night. And whereas before night fell, the company saw a great steam rising up from Isengard, during the night the water was let loose and came back down the river Isen. Something was still happening up at Isengard. And the men knew not what this portended, but would later learn that the Ents redirected the river and broke dams, destroying and drowning Isengard. They would continue on in the morning, finally making it to Isengard where they met Merry and Pippin. Again, the character interactions here are phenomenal, and more in-depth than they are in the movie, although, of course, many interactions in the movie are still really good. The men of Rohan remark at the hobbits, for they knew of similar folk called Hobbitlan from stories, as indeed their ancestors, the Eotheid, lived close to where the first hobbits dwelt, near the river Anduin. Theoden and Merry began to develop a very impactful relationship, similar to that of a father and son, and the three hunters, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, finally reunited with those they had hunted after at the beginning of the Two Towers. And since this is at the end of the Two Towers book, it wraps up that story arc in a really nice way. These 5 members of the Fellowship reunite, and Merry and Pippin told of the destruction of Isengard, which we spoke of in the last episode, while they ate reserves from Isengard and smoked pipeweed, while Gandalf and the others spoke to Treebeard and made ready to speak to Saruman. Indeed, speaking to Saruman was dangerous, and Gandalf was ready for this. His last power was in his voice, and this was shown more heavily here than in the movie, for Saruman is actually almost able to convince the men of Rohan, who he wronged greatly, that he was actually their ally, and that Gandalf was their enemy. Had the White Rider not been there and been so powerful, and had the wills of Eomer and Theoden not been so strong, things would have gone ill. But indeed, Gandalf proved his mastery, for at this point he was far greater than Saruman in power and purpose, and he cast him from the Order of the Astari and the White Council, and broke his staff. This was very personal for Gandalf, especially in the book, and he demonstrated his power, even in his own voice. During this conversation, Grima threw the Palantir out of Orthanc, but it seemed he had aimed at both wizards, not deciding who he hated more, and missed both. Pippin picked it up, and the company set out after Gandalf took it from him, with Saruman and Grima both being very much alive, and Saruman being quite angry with Grima in the tower. They will come back into the story far later in this series. The company departed Isengard, with Treebeard agreeing to keep watch on it and Saruman, keeping them inside the tower. There were more character interactions, and that night, while they were all camped near the Isen, Pippin could not sleep, for his mind was still on the Palantir that he picked up earlier. He decided to steal it from Gandalf and decided to look at it, getting involved in the affairs of wizards, similarly to how he does in the movie. And while Pippin did not reveal anything important to Sauron here either, Sauron thought, since Pippin was communicating through the Orthanc stone, that he was a hobbit who might have the One Ring, and that Saruman had taken it from him. He told Pippin to tell Saruman the ring would be retrieved and the wizard could not have it. While Pippin was then saved by Gandalf from Sauron's gaze, many events took place. It was not soon after that Sauron made good on his promise, and a winged Nazgul flew overhead of the company, headed for Isengard to question Saruman. This, of course, was a book-only event. Gandalf knew that great haste was needed, so he gave the king-to-be Aragorn the Palantir, for it was an artifact of Númenor, used by the kings of old, and Gandalf took Pippin with him upon Shadowfax, heading off swiftly that night from near the fords of the Isen to Minas Tirith. None would actually return to Edoras as they do in the movie. Rather, Theoden's company would go on to Dunharrow, where Éowyn kept safe many folk of the Mark. And it would not be long after this very moment that the great company of rangers arrived from the north, again a book-only moment, with prophetic words for Aragorn. But we shall get into that more in the next episode. Gandalf and Pippin rode quickly towards Minas Tirith as Gandalf recited to himself and Pippin more about the Palantiri, answering some of the Hobbit's many, many questions. That ends Book 3 in the Two Towers. So in the next episode, the story having to do with these characters will be drawn from the Return of the King book, while Frodo, Sam, and Gollum's book equivalent still comes from the end of the Two Towers, as again the stories are cut in very different ways on the screen versus on the page. With that, we end today's episode beginning the What's Different series with the Return of the King. From this episode of What's Different, we see the hope that Frodo saw. Evil and darkness cannot overcome the good and light in people, not forever. Gandalf depicted just how bright he and his power were, compared to the weakness of Saruman and his evil. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all liked this video of our What's Different series. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections about this part of the What's Different series? Let me know in the comments below. This part of the book and movie really set up the final battles to come in the Return of the King, both in great and pretty different ways, with one version taking place at the end of the Two Towers and the other at the beginning of the Return of the King, emphasizing different story arcs and themes with each book or movie. To further support the channel, please check out our music channel, Facebook, Twitter, merch, and Patreon for a podcast and Discord server. All of those links are in the description below. Roy and I just did a podcast on some morally gray characters in Tolkien's works, so if that sounds interesting, please check it out on our Patreon. I want to shout out our Valar tier patrons: Adrian De La Tour, Chris Ortner, Peter Shepard, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralik, Blair Scouten, Tobias Goldner, Ryan Ramsey, Adam Rank, Merton, and John Hume. Thank you guys so much. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today, and I'll see you all again next week with an epic character history on Boromir, the High Warden of the White Tower. Everyone, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my great friends.